Hey everyone, we're just going to give everyone an extra minute to show up. So we'll get started at 9:01 Central Time. Talk to you soon. Hey everyone, and thanks for coming to the Right-Click Tools and Advanced Scenarios webinar. My name is Chris Muster. I'm the CTO here at Recast Software, and today I'm joined by Marty Miller. Marty is a customer success manager at Recast, and he helps our customers with any technical questions that they have with the product. He's going to be keeping an eye on the Q&A today, so if you have a question as we're going through stuff, feel free to ask it in the Q&A section, and he'll try to get through. He'll try to answer those as we're going through things. If you're watching this on the YouTube live stream, you can use YouTube chat to ask your questions, and we'll try to keep an eye on those as well. Today, we're going to be talking about a subset of what's available in the right-click tools. All right, when we typically talk about right-click tools, we talk about them, in terms of a couple of different categories. Right, we have our productivity tools, where we're really meaning our client actions, client tools, console tools. We're going to be demoing a portion of the system info tool today, but it's really not the focus of this webinar. Today, we're going to be more focused on this enterprise ready category, where we're talking about some of the features that Recast Management Server and some of the other components to the enterprise right-click tools get you. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on the upper right portion of that blue section. So our cloud management gateway support, fast channel support, workgroup, and untrusted domains. And we will cover, maybe some of the other components a little bit, but we're really focused on the routing layer in this webinar. As far as the other features, actionable dashboards, our automation platform and builder runner, and our kiosk management solutions, we actually did a webinar on those last month. So if you're interested in those, I'd recommend going to our YouTube channel and checking those out. Marty and I went through most of the features that are available inside of those, and those are still available on YouTube for you to look at historically. But today, we're going to be covering this enterprise ready tier. And before we jump in, we're going to kick off a poll just to get an idea of how people might be using Recast Management Server in the future, right? Are you, if any of these scenarios fit your needs, we'd be interested in hearing about it, because we think that the components we had in this webinar, or we talk about in this webinar, are going to address some of these needs, and we're just curious what the mix is. So feel free to answer that at your leisure. So today, I mentioned we're going to be focusing on this enterprise ready tier. In particular, we're going to be focusing on areas that have that controlled routing icon on them, right? The cloud management gateway, fast channel support, workgroup devices, and untrusted domains. These are areas where, in my opinion, Recast Management Server really shines, right? It allows you to customize where and how right-click tools are being run within your organization in order to be able to extend the right-click tools to those environments. We won't talk as much about some of the other features, right? We have this web-based reporting feature in here. That's actually coming in full for 4.4. So if you're curious about that, sign up for our webinar next month. We won't talk about task scheduling. We will touch on audit logging as well as permissions a little bit. Over on the right, we have the different components to the enterprise right-click tools that you can install in your environment. And really you can kind of see the core to all of this is that Recast Management Server, right? It's the piece that kind of controls all of these other features that are on the page, and it's kind of the decision point where you can control where and how right-click tools are being run, control your permissions, etc. Then we have our Recast Proxy component that lets you run any right-click action as a specific service account. And the cool thing about Recast Proxy is that service account doesn't require any trust relationship, or it doesn't require isn't required to be in the same domain as your Recast management server, right? So your service accounts can be in untrusted domains, or they could be in the same domain if you need to run certain actions as a different user. That's all available for you. So Recast Proxy is kind of our vehicle for extending actions into to target users, devices, and other Active Directory objects in untrusted domains. We have our Recast Agent component, and that is really about running actions as local system. And it does this by running a bit of code on the box that's launched as local system and receiving actions, but from the Recast management server. But the problems it solves are the local admin rights problem, right? So I don't no longer need to be a local admin on the remote boxes that I intend to manage because I have this Recast agent installed. And it also solves the firewall issue, right? In a default install of right-click tools, we need to open up some firewall ports to be able to interact with the remote devices on our network. Recast Agent eliminates that need because it maintains a persistent connection either back to your Recast management server, if you choose to use the Recast Agent communications channel, or maintains that persistent connection back through to your config manager management point if you decide to use the config manager fast channel. So there's a fair amount of flexibility even within Recast Agent. We'll talk about that today as well. But before we dive in to how to set this up, how to configure your routes and scopes and such, it's useful to kind of get a lay of the land, an understanding of how things change as we add the various components to the right-click tools. And so what we have here is a default right-click tools installation without Recast management server. This is what you get when you go to our website and download the community version or set up your enterprise standalone tools without that server. And so we have a config manager admin console with the right-click tools installed, and the config man user runs an action, and that action will actually reach out directly to the remote devices via remote WMI, remote registry, admin share, any sort of remote ports that it needs. And everything is running in the context of that config manager console user. So that user needs to have permission to run the action directly on the remote devices, right? It needs, in a default Windows install, that user needs local admin permissions on remote devices. And that remote device needs to be configured to allow connections via remote WMI, remote registry, ICMP echo, and those types of things in order for the right-click tools to successfully run. When you add Recast management server into the mix, things change a little bit, but the overall result is the same in a default Recast management server installation. So out of the box, you install Recast management server. It will actually send all of the actions back to the right-click tools. So the flow works where the user runs an action. The action gets sent up to the server. The server does a bit of processing on the action to determine, all right, does this user have permission to run the action? It logs it to the audit log, and then it goes through the Recast management server routing layer. And the default set of routes on Recast management server are configured to basically send it back to the right-click tools to run. So everything from an end user perspective or a right-click tools user perspective operates in exactly the same way as it did when you had community and enterprise standalone. The admin console or the right-click tools installed in the admin console are reaching out directly to the end user devices and over WMI, remote registry, remote file system, and that user needs to have admin rights on the remote box. So we haven't extended the right-click tools as far as the capabilities for reaching remote devices. Really, what we've added by adding Recast management server is our centralized permissions, audit logging, centralized license management, and settings management for right-click tools. Where things start to get a little bit more interesting is when we add Recast Agent into the mix. And Recast Agent is our way of running actions without admin rights. And the cool thing about Recast Agent is the agent itself maintains that connection back to the Recast management server. So you no longer need to worry about opening up any ports on those remote devices, right? We have an outbound connection from Recast Agent to Recast Management Server on the port you specify, and by default, the Windows firewall allows outbound connections. And I mentioned before, you can configure this to work with the fast channel. We'll talk about that in a bit. The other nice thing about Recast Agent is that your default Recast Management Server installation is configured to work with Recast Agent out of the box. So as you light up Recast Agents in your environment, the actions will just will automatically be routed to them without you having to configure anything on Recast Management Server. By default, we have 2 routes configured. Now I'll talk through those in a little bit, but the first route is our Recast Agent route. And if there are no, when the user runs an action from the right-click tools and gets sent to Recast Management Server, that routing layer will say, all right, do any of the targets of this action have Recast Agent installed? And is that target currently connected to Recast Management Server? If so, I'm going to send it down that Recast Agent communications layer to be run directly on the agent. If it isn't connected, it'll move on to the next route, which by default, again, is that Config Manager console route where it'll be sent back to the right-click tools to work as it did in the last slide. So that's Recast Agent. Again, as simple as just installing the agent on devices, and we'll demo that in a little bit here. Where things get maybe a little more complicated is our untrusted domain scenario or a multi-domain scenario. And you think about this in the context of like buying corporations, right? So we have Corporation A with domain A, Corporation B with domain B, and we want to be able to extend our right-click tools into Corporation B's network without setting up any trust relationships between them. Well, what we can do is spin up a Recast Proxy inside of domain B, right? Install Recast Proxy on a device in domain B and set it up with a service account in domain B that has permissions to run right-click tools in that environment. And when I say permissions to run right-click tools, I mean like the end device permissions, right? Admin on remote workstations, or permissions in Active Directory to look up lapse passwords or MBAM keys and that type of thing. So this is a little bit more involved, right? We have to set up a couple of things for this to work. It doesn't work out of the box, but you install the Recast Proxy, you configure a route to send actions down to that proxy, and typically your route will have some sort of scope assigned, and the scope is what determines where things get routed. Where you'll have you might say send it to proxy B for all devices that are in untrusted domain B that are inside of this particular OU, or you might say, well, anything inside of domain B, go ahead and send it to this proxy. But you could also configure it at the collection level as well. All right, so you could say, well, if I'm targeting devices inside of this device collection, send it to this proxy. Or if I'm targeting users inside of this user collection, send it to this other proxy. And again, you can work at the site level too. So it's fairly flexible in what you can do. And again, that Recast Proxy service account doesn't have any requirements for trust relationship with the Recast Management Server domain, right? It can be in a completely different domain. It doesn't matter. All right, and the last scenario we're going to kind of demo here is running the right-click tools over the Config Manager fast channel. This actually involves all of the components that we've talked about, right? Recast Management Server, Proxy, and Recast Agent. And the flow here is, you have the right-click tools installed, you send the action up to the Recast Management Server, and you set up a Config Manager fast channel route on your Recast Management Server. And when you're setting up that route, you'll have to set up a Config Manager scope with it. And the Config Manager scope basically queries Config Manager for all devices that are compatible with the features of the fast channel that we're using, right? We use the run scripts feature inside of the fast channel. So we look for devices with, I think, the config client 1706 or later, and we're also looking for devices that have a relatively recent Recast Agent installed on them. And the reason we need that Recast Agent is because we're relying on a WMI provider component that's installed on those. to do the bulk of the work. And I'll get to that in a minute. So, Recast Management Server with that route configured will actually send the action over to Recast Proxy, and Recast Proxy is responsible for translating the action into the parameters that the PowerShell script that sits inside the config server needs in order to execute. So the Recast Proxy acts as a translation layer between what Recast Management Server sends it and what the config manager server needs. It tells the server, the config man server, to run the script on the remote devices. The server sends the script down to the management point via the normal fast channel notification mechanism. And then that PowerShell script is actually calling into the WMI provider that I was talking about. So it calls into that Recast Agent WMI provider to do the bulk of the work, sends the action results back up via the PowerShell output, and the Recast Proxy monitors the script execution and translates the data back into a form that can be understood by that Recast Management Server. So it's a fairly complex orchestration process, but it's only a route and a scope away from getting it to execute in your environment, and we'll kind of demo that as well. As far as like the WMI provider component, we need that for a couple of reasons. One, it made spinning this feature up really easy for us from a development perspective. Right, we could iterate really fast on getting this feature out the door. But two, and probably more importantly, is that we needed to be able to preserve state on the config manager clients. One of the problems with the config manager fast channel notification layer is that we're limited in the size of the messages that we can pass back and forth. And some of the right-click tools actions actually return more data than the fast channel allows us to return in a single run script call. So the WMI provider helps maintain state on the remote device, so we can orchestrate multiple run script actions to pull all of the data back from a single action call. And the end result of that is the right-click tools just kind of work the way you expect, right? So you run the list services tab of the system info tool, and you get all of the services there instead of quitting out after the first 10 services or so because we're returning too much data. And so why might you run the right-click tools on the fast channel? Well, it lets you run right-click tools without admin rights. It lets you remove any remote firewall needs on the devices. We kind of talked about those in the context of Recast Agent. And if you're looking for just those two features, I'd recommend looking at Recast Agent first, because Recast Agent's communication layer is significantly faster. It's actually the fastest way to run right-click tools in an organization. So it'll give you the best user experience if you use the Recast Agent communications channel, but it's not the type of thing where you have to choose, right? You can configure Recast Agent to work both over the fast channel layer as well as that Recast Agent communication layer. So you can kind of get the best of both worlds, where you're saying, if the Recast Agent layer is available, use that. Otherwise, fall back to that fast channel layer. And we'll actually demo that in a little bit. That last bullet point is where I think the fast channel layer really shines, right? If you have a cloud management gateway, this is the way you can run right-click tools against devices that aren't on your corporate network. So you can, you don't have to have any VPN or direct access requirements for your end users for this to work. All right, so that's enough slides for now. Let's jump into the demo. And before we do the demo, it's just interesting to go through some of the poll results. It looks like 15% or so have untrusted domains. More people are in that zero trust or workgroup device scenario, which is great. As maybe to be expected, we have a lot of non-VPN connected devices, or devices that are remote, and some limited local admin rights as well as firewall, which is great to see. So the Recast Agent might be a scenario that you'd be interested in, or it sounds like Recast Agent might be a scenario that a good chunk of the audience might be interested in. So I've got the newest version of right-click tools installed here. I'm going to go over to a device collection, and I'm actually going to launch the system information tool against all systems. And as I launch that, We're going to see the system info tool pop up. And before I really get into it, I just want to show that, this installation is connected to a Recast management server. And that Recast management server has kind of the default configuration, right? So from a routing perspective, this is the out of the box default. So we're going to try to use that Recast Agent proxy first, and then we'll fall back to the config console user proxy. And so when I run this, we're going to see, a number of devices working, right? My user account is able to reach out via remote WMI and look at some of this information. But probably more interesting, we have a couple of devices in an error state. All right, so we have 3 devices in this access denied state. And as I expand that, we can see that these are all workgroup devices. Right? These are devices I don't have permission on because they're not, they don't trust the user account on the domain I'm in. So I'm not able to hit those with, either an enterprise standalone or default Recast management server install without Recast Agent. We have a couple with the computer not on error. And what's interesting here is, some of these are actually in untrusted domains. And, so we have some sort of DNS issue, but even if DNS was working, I wouldn't be able to hit these devices because there is no trust between that domain and my domain. So we're hitting, again, we're hitting, we would hit an access denied issue, even if we added the support for getting that device in DNS correctly. And so, we'll walk through that in a little bit as well. And then we have this RPC server unavailable error. Again, another firewall issue where, this device just doesn't have remote WMI opened up, so I can't hit it. What we're going to start by solving this access denied issue on workgroup 01. And so I'm going to pop over to workgroup 01. And here I've downloaded Recast Agent on workgroup 01. I'm just going to run through an install real quick. And as I go through this, it'll prompt for a Recast management server. I had this configured to connect to a different Recast management server at some point, so it's pulling that in. But I'm going to point it at that test environment. I'm going to test the connection, make sure everything's good to go. And then note here, we have this option to only install config manager fast channel support. So if I check that box, it's not going to actually use that server connectivity, right? It's not going to maintain that Recast Agent communication layer back to Recast management server. I would only recommend checking this box for devices that are never going to be on your corporate network, right? These for devices that you're only going to interact with the CMG. Like I said before, Recast Agent communication layer is the fastest way to run right-click tools. So you're much better off just leaving it on. It doesn't hurt anything if it can't connect. It'll just it'll just fail to connect and try again on some interval. So I'm going to leave that unchecked now to demonstrate that Recast Agent layer. And hit install. So there's not much to the install. It'll kind of go do its thing. While it's doing that, I'm going to pop back over to our Recast management server. And I'm going to go into the web UI here. And actually, I'm going to go to the Agents tab. And we can see we already have a Recast Agent that showed up. That workgroup 01 device has already showed up on our network here. And if I hit F5, we can see it's actually trying to connect. And it's giving us an error that, hey, it's trying to connect, but it's not approved. And so we can't actually send actions to it until it's approved. That approval process can be controlled by a setting. By default, it's over here under settings, Recast Agent approval. By default, we choose to automatically approve things in trusted domains. And that trusted part is relative to the Recast management server. So anything that's in a domain that's trusted by the Recast management server domain will be automatically approved. You can also change it to automatically approve all agents. If I had chosen that option, my workgroup device would have just automatically been approved. Or you can manually approve each agent. And these should look familiar, right? These are the same sets of options that you get on a config manager site when you're automatically approving config-man clients to interact with your site. And we choose the same defaults as the config-man product team there, where we're approving things in trusted domains. But since I installed this agent before I configure that setting, I have to go and configure it or approve it manually. So to do that, I come over to Agents, I hit Edit, and I check the box and hit Save. And notice our error went away, and in a minute we should see it connected via that Recast Agent communication layer. And so now when I come over here and hit refresh, I didn't touch routes here at all. And we notice, right off the bat that we only have 2 devices that are showing access denied now, right? And it's workgroup 0, 2, and 3. And workgroup 0, 1 is actually up here somewhere right there. So just by installing Recast Agent on workgroup 0, 1, we were able to get the right-click tools working on it. We didn't have to configure anything else in Recast Management Server except for that approval process. So that's great. If I wanted, I could do the same thing for workgroup 0, 2, and 3, but I'm going to leave those for now and focus more on these untrusted domains, right? So how do I get right-click tools extended to work in this untrusted domain scenario? For that, I'm going to pop over to this Recast workstation, untrust WKS, and we're going to install Recast Proxy on it. So here we go. I have my Recast untrusted workstation, and I'm just going to get my password in there. And again, I've downloaded Recast Proxy from portal.recastsoftware.com, and I'm just going to double click it and walk through the install process. Hit next, and same idea as the Recast Agent. I have to type in my server name and the port that I've configured my server to use. Hit test and make sure everything works. And then the only difference here is now we have to configure a service account, right? Recast Agent runs as local system, but for this, I have to configure username and password in order for it to function. So again, I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to not type things in when I don't have to. And as I hit test here, we should see user credentials valid. So when I send actions to this proxy, they're going to run as this service account. So I need to make sure that this service account is adequately permissioned in my environment, right? Either to look things up in Active Directory or interact with any SMS providers that might be in this site, or have local admin rights on remote devices if I want to run actions directly against devices. So I'm going to hit install. And same idea, I'm going to pop back over to my Recast Management Server. And this time I'm going to go to the Proxies tab. And again, we see it come in as we're watching it install. We get the same warning. It's trying to connect. And again, this is an untrusted domain. So we have a very similar setting to that Recast Agent approval. We have a Recast Proxy approval setting. And when I come in here, we have the same sets of defaults, right? Only approve things in trusted domains. That device is in an untrusted domain, so it did not automatically approve, and I have to go and approve it manually. And again, it's the same process. Come to the device, hit edit, authorize it to connect, and it should connect pretty quick. So that's getting the proxy approved, but remember, only Recast Agent and the right-click tools are configured to work out of the box in when running actions. So I need to do a little bit of extra work to send actions to this Recast Proxy. And the way we do that, the way we choose where to send actions to proxy is through scopes. Right. And a scope is like a bundle of devices and users, devices or users that I want to target with specific actions. And so for this, I'm going to tell it I want to do untrusted domain, and I'm going to actually we get a couple of options for how we want to configure our scope, like I mentioned before. Right, we can choose everything in a domain, but we can also get more specific, where we say, well, anything in this OU or this container, go ahead and send to a proxy running as this service account, right? So maybe if you have a server's service account, you could target your server's OU and send it to your service account controlled by your server team, and maybe have one for your workstation's OU to target things for your workstation's team. Or similar for device collections, right? You can say either everything in the config-man site, or specify a specific device collection so that you can target your server's device collection or your workstation's device collection. For this example, I'm just going to target everything in that untrusted domain, and it's going to prompt me for which domain I care about. I'm going to hit create, and we get a warning about we're not able to evaluate the scope because we haven't configured a proxy to route to it yet. So I'm going to come over to routes. I'm going to create a service account route targeted to my Recast proxy. If I wanted, I could configure which actions this Recast proxy is allowed to run, right? So if I choose the administrator's role, it's basically saying every action in right-click tools, this proxy is allowed to run. But I also have a lapse role here, right? So if I wanted to limit this to very specific actions, so that maybe I have a proxy that's only going to look up lapse passwords, for example, I could limit which actions are allowed to be routed to it on the permission level, and say, well, when I'm doing lapse lookup, send it to this proxy. All other actions, fall down to another route in the list. For this example, I want to run all actions that are in this untrusted domain scope against this proxy, right? So it's basically anytime I target this domain with an action, it's going to be sent to this proxy, regardless of what action it is. So I'm going to hit create here, and I'm actually going to move it up above that config console user proxy scope, or excuse me, route. That route is kind of a catch-all route. Notice it doesn't have any roles or scopes associated with it. It's just going to, any action that it can, it's going to send back. And in my case, I wanted to determine if it should be sent to the service account first. So that's the reason for putting it in order. And kind of the flow for these routes as configured are going to be, first, the server is going to evaluate, all right, do I have a recast agent that's currently connected? Connected is true over here. If so, I'm going to send it directly to that agent. Then it's going to say, all right, am I targeting a device or a user in an untrusted domain, or am I running an Active Directory action against that untrusted domain? If so, I'm going to send it to the service account. And for everything else, I'm going to fall back to that config console user proxy. All right, so we have our scope. We notice we still have this, our untrusted domain scope still isn't populated. So I'm going to hit repopulate here. Just make sure it's working. And we see it took a second to populate, and now we should be good to go. That route should start working. And so when I come back over here and hit refresh, we should see less devices in our computer is not on category. Right? And when I expand these, we should be able to find our untrusted domain controller, for example. And if I scroll down, I'm sure I'll find the untrusted workstation as well. All right, and so everything's running as that service account in that untrusted domain. So now, now we've extended our right-click tools to another scenario. The last scenario I want to talk through is that fast channel scenario. And I mentioned, it kind of touches, it has multiple components to it, right? We already have the Recast Management Server configured. As part of that Recast Management Server installation, it actually prompted us to create a Recast Proxy. And so we have our default Recast Proxy already connected and authorized here. And that's installed by default, in the default Recast Management Server install. It's installed on the same box as your server. You don't have to. You can install it somewhere else if you just choose to do it that way. But in a default install, we're installed here. I've configured it with this RMS prod proxy account. So I just have to make sure that account has permissions to do the things that I want to do. And in the case of the fast channel, I need to be able to see devices inside of the config console. All right, so I have to be able to get information about these devices as well as hardware inventory information about these devices, because we're actually going to check to make sure that hardware inventory is reporting that the Recast Agent component is installed with an adequate version. And I need the ability to run a script. Now, when we talk about scripts, we have, I've already imported some scripts. In order to run the fast channel, you actually have to import a PowerShell script, and we include that in the right-click tools install in the extras folder. So if you browse to your right-click tools installation folder, go to extras, you can import the Recast fast channel script, and you can give it any name you want. It doesn't matter. We target it based on hash value. But the important part is that service account that you've configured actually needs permissions to be able to run that script, right? So over here in security administration, we can see that same account, RMS Prod Proxy, we've given it full admin rights in this scenario, but you don't have to give it full admin, right? You need to be able to read the devices and device collection memberships if you're using a device collection scope, as well as to be able to execute that script. All right, so I mentioned scopes a couple of times. Let's go ahead and create our config manager scope. In this case, I'm going to choose a config manager site scope. I could choose config man device collection as well. The only important thing is I need a scope that targets config manager that returns a list of devices, right? And both the site and the device collection scope will do that. So again, I'm going to choose site scope. I'm going to point it at our dev instance here and hit create. We're going to get that same kind of routing error. So I'm going to come over to routes and create a config manager fast channel route. And so, we get a couple of options here. The first is, which proxy do I want this to run against? So I'm going to choose that RMS Prod Proxy user account. And then which config manager fast channel scope do I want to execute against? And we filter the list of scopes. Notice untrusted domain doesn't show up here because, again, we need that config manager scope to be able to successfully execute this. So I'm going to create that, and I'm going to move my fast channel scope again up above my config man console user proxy, so that before things before things go back to the right-click tools, we're going to try every other method that's available to us. And this one works kind of similar to Recast Agent, right? We're going to filter on device or actions that target devices. And in this case, we're going to, again, do that query against config managers, say, all right, do these devices have compatible config man client? Do they have Recast Agent installed? If those two things are true, we'll go ahead and execute that PowerShell script. All right, so I've saved this. I'm going to come over to scopes and hit repopulate, make sure my scope is working. So there we go. And that should be all I have to configure to come back and hit refresh. So as I hit refresh here, we're going to see it, maybe take a little bit longer because we're actually executing a PowerShell script on some of these devices. So if I come over here to monitoring and script status, give it a second. I sort by this client operation ID. We can see a bunch of scripts running right now. And actually that one completed, and we can see it ran against this server 2012 R2 box. And what did it run? Well, it ran our system information action, get general information. So, we're actually sending the script, the actions over to the scripts. And notice our errors are significantly lower in number. Right? We do have a couple of devices down here that are still showing computer not on. Right? These are devices that, these are devices where maybe they don't have the Recast Agent installed, and so they didn't hit that fast channel scope, and we went back to the right-click tools, and we weren't able to connect to them. Right, so we still have some configuration to do, although you're not going to be able to run the right-click tools if the devices aren't on. But as I come over here, I can see some interesting things. Right, I can again see that same untrusted workstation, untrusted domain worked as expected. If I scroll down a little bit, I can see workgroup 02 and 03 are showing up in this list now. And the reason for that is they actually have a Recast Agent installed on them, pointed at a different Recast management server. But because the Recast Agent is installed, our fast channel scopes detected that they were capable of running the fast channel. So these actually ran over the fast channel on these devices. And so by adding that scope, we've extended our action to devices that our Recast management server isn't even aware of, which is great. And then probably more interesting is we have this Recast CMG01 device that was failing before. This is actually connected to the CMG. It's not on our corporate network. and we're able to target it by using that fast channel scope. So, it really improved our capability of running right-click tools in our environment just by adding a couple of different rules there. The last bit I want to touch on is anytime we talk about scopes and such, it's kind of useful to come over here and get a look at, for example, proxies. Where are these actions being run? Right? We can see that, a number of actions were routed to our default recast proxy. Some were routed to the right-click tools, and some actually went to that untrusted workstation. So that's kind of cool to see. Another thing to note here, when we added that fast channel scope, look at the execution time, right? So we have our get general information that I've run a couple of times. It took 42 seconds earlier today. It took a minute here. So we did add a little bit of time as we're, interacting with that fast channel layer. That fast channel does add a fair bit of time to the execution. So something to keep in mind. Again, that's the main reason for putting the recast agent route first, is that we're using the fastest option available to us before some of those other options. And the last thing I want to mention is that scopes are kind of dual purpose in our in Recast Management Server. So I can actually go ahead and use those on the permissions layer. So if I decided maybe Mark shouldn't be able to run right-click tools against every device in the environment, maybe he's specifically an admin for devices in the untrusted domain, I can limit him to only devices and user objects in that untrusted domain. Or works for config band scopes too. So you can get very granular on your permissions model to say that, for example, your service desk is allowed to run all right-click tools against devices in the workstation collection and maybe only ping computer for devices in the servers collection. Or, scope it by OU, where you say, well, maybe you're a K through 12 and you have some high school admins and some middle school admins and some elementary school admins, and you want to be able to scope permissions to only devices in those areas. You can do that with recast scopes by using this interface. So I think that concludes the demo portion. I'm going to hand this back to Marty to talk about some extra resources you can use to getting all of this configured in your environment.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I am Marty. I'm the Customer Success Manager here at Recast Software. And what I would like to show, and then we will go ahead and do Q&A after I show some of these resources. So if you can think of a question that you have, we have a couple that we're going to answer. But if you can think of any additional questions that you might have, you can go ahead and start putting those in Q&A, and we'll talk about them afterward. But there are a couple of things that we wanted to make sure that we pointed out about some resources on getting these things set up. The first that we wanted to point out is our website, which for the documentation, which is docs.recastsoftware.com. And you're going to find a lot of information there about installation. So you can actually see how to do some of these installation things and some of the setups that Chris was working through. For example, this is actually Right-Click Tools Enterprise with Management Server and Proxy. So that's a lot of stuff there. We also do have the additional with Config Manager Fast Channel support. So if you're interested in installing and setting up fast channel support, you can take a look at this page here as well. There is additional documentation on all the features of the product of Right-Click Tools. There's also, and the Recast Management Server for that matter. And there's also troubleshooting. So if there are some errors that you're seeing, or if you're, if you're getting those errors where you can't connect to WMI, there's some things here as well to take a look at. So that is our, and then we can also search. So if you had a question or a component or an error that you were getting, you could absolutely search right up here. The next one that we wanted to point out is our blog. So at recastsoftware.com/blog, we have blogs that are written by Gary Block about the different features that are in Right-Click Tools. He does an endpoint management recap every month, and just other information about Recast Management Server, and right-click tools. So just if you potentially were looking to find some information about the fast channel, you absolutely could do a search right here. And not only do we have documentation, Gary also wrote a blog about how to use the config manager fast channel in your environment as well. So you can also look there. And finally, the other thing that we wanted to point out is just our general enterprise support information. If you haven't taken a look at it, or potentially you've forgotten, if you go to recastsoftware.com/support, there are a couple of different ways that you can reach us. If you'd like to submit a ticket, you can go ahead and do that right here. If you'd like to schedule a call, you can do that right here, and that will put, it actually does a scheduling link that looks at the availability of our calendar, and you can go ahead and pick right from there. Of course, it's going to take a minute today, apparently, but that's fine. So that will go ahead and show up a calendar that you can select to pick a date for a call. The other thing that you can do is, if I wasn't on a webinar right now, this would actually have my face in it and say, Marty Miller, how can I help you? That kind of thing. So what you can actually do is, if you see me online, feel free to go ahead and, if you have a quick question, go ahead and send it here, submit it, and we can chat basically over the computer. We can chat about what your questions might be. Similarly, even if we're not online and you just wanted to leave a message this way, you absolutely could. It is going to send an email to me, and it also creates a ticket to make sure that we follow back up with you. So those are some of the resources that we have, and we just wanted to make sure that you were aware of those as well. So what we are going to do now is we'll go ahead and answer some questions that you guys had, or you all had, about what we were just talking about, and we will go ahead and do that. On our first question is, if I'm using agent, do I need to use a proxy in my untrusted domain or for untrusted domains? You do not necessarily need to use proxy if you are using agent. As Chris mentioned, the way that the routing layers work out of the box is it will attempt to send to any computers that it knows have agent on them first. So you wouldn't necessarily need to use proxy for an untrusted domain. Proxy is going to come into play with agent if you're doing something over fast channel or the cloud managed gateway. But if everything's on the network and you just want to use agent instead of a proxy in your untrusted domain, you could absolutely do that. That would work.
There's one extra caveat to that.
Okay.
For untrusted domain scenarios, anything that interacts with Active Directory will not work if you only have Recast Agent. So if your goal is to modify group memberships of users in that untrusted domain, or reset passwords, unlock user accounts, or manage group memberships of devices in that untrusted domain, those actions won't work until you get Recast Proxy up. But everything else, most of the right-click tools will work with just Recast Agent in that untrusted domain scenario.
Very good. Hey, Chris, can you stay online for this next question as well, which talks about high availability? So the question is, in my untrusted domains, I have 2 DPs, so everything is HA. In my SCCM environment, can the proxy be configured on both domains to provide HA in each domain? So if one proxy is down for maintenance, right-click will still work on all machines in that domain.
Yeah, absolutely. So you could configure the same Recast Proxy service account on multiple devices, and have routes to both proxies or multiple proxies. And as if the proxy is down, it'll just skip over it. It'll move on to the next proxy. Same exact scenario there. But yeah, great question.
Yeah, very, very good. Will we need to do a new push of agents when a new version comes out? That is an excellent question. And generally what we do recommend with that is that that you do actually upgrade the agents as a new version comes out. One of the things that we are working toward is trying to make that a little bit easier for you. We do also have silent install strings of those agents if you're not already using those to get those installed. So you could do that from a like a config manager application install. You absolutely could install it that way. And that new version will then just upgrade essentially the agent that is already on the device, and connect. But yeah, another good question.
Yeah, and just start to riff on that a little bit. The agent, you know, we recommend staying up to date just because new actions might not work on that agent if there's if there's any mismatch there. So for example, 4.3, we introduced the send notification tool, right? If you have an agent that's older, you try to run the send notification tool against that agent, you'll get some sort of error. I don't know the exact error that'll show up, but it won't be able to run that action. And so that, that's kind of the reason for keeping up to date. Anything old that used to work should still work on the Recast agent, right? The system info tool didn't really change in 4.3 from a backend standpoint. So, all those actions would still work even if you upgraded your Recast management server without agent.
Yeah, so it's kind of like the new bells and whistles aren't necessarily going to work simply because the agent doesn't know what to do with that command, right? It sees it, but it didn't exist when it was created, so it's not sure what to do. Yeah, great. If there's any additional questions, we'll hang on here for a couple of minutes just to see if anybody has any other questions. All right. Hearing none, if you do have any additional questions or other things that you can think of, if you just didn't want to bring it up in this meeting or something like that, or if you're watching on YouTube later, absolutely go ahead and on that enterprise customer support page right there, go ahead and submit a ticket or send a message, and just let us know what kind of questions you might have, and we are absolutely available to help to answer. We sometimes get a question on, is this all part of the enterprise licensing? And I think it's great to mention that yes, all the things that you saw today are part of enterprise licensing. So if you don't have this stuff set up yet, there isn't any additional cost. If you want additional support to get it set up, that's what we're here for, and we can absolutely help you out. All right, well, thanks everybody. I think I hope that was very helpful, and we thank you for joining us, and hope that you all have a great rest of your day.